Let's talk about a crime. A huge, multi-decade heist that was pulled on the entire global economy. It was a trap so perfectly built that it crippled the world, shifted trillions of dollars in wealth, and completely redrew the map of geopolitical power. Now, what if I told you the criminals got away with it, laid low for 50 years, and then ran the exact same playbook all over again? Well, that's the story we're getting into today. A crime in two acts.
So here's the big question, right? How did this happen? How was the same fundamental trap that was sprung with oil back in 1973 set all over again for uranium today? Is this just some kind of freak coincidence, or are we looking at a repeatable blueprint for manufacturing a crisis and, profiting from it?
Well, when you start to unpack the evidence, piece by piece, it becomes pretty clear this was no accident, not at all. It's a pattern, a signature method. And by understanding this blueprint, we can see not only how the trap was set, but more importantly, who's cashing in on it. Okay, let's dive in.
First things first, let's look at the actual blueprint for this crime. The criminal's MO. It's a method built on 6 very specific pillars. You get these in place for any strategic commodity, and you can basically cook up a crisis on demand. So, pillar number 1 is the bait, the lure. For decades before 1973, Middle Eastern oil was just dirt cheap. I mean, why would you spend a fortune on expensive domestic projects when you can import the stuff for pennies? Now, fast forward to the 2010s. After the Fukushima disaster, uranium prices totally crashed, way below what it even cost to produce. In both cases, the market signal was basically a lie. It was screaming abundance, which killed any incentive to invest and created this deep, deep dependency that was just disguised as efficiency.
Now, here's the really wild part. The warnings weren't secret. They were totally out in the open. OPEC was created way back in 1960. That's a full 13 years before the crisis hit. Their whole purpose as a cartel was public knowledge, but the world just kind of shrugged it off because the oil kept flowing. It's the same story today. For the last decade, organizations like the World Nuclear Association have been publishing reports on Kazakhstan's march to 40% market share and Russia's stranglehold on enrichment. The risk was known, it was tracked, and it was just politically ignored.
And this right here is where a lot of people get the story wrong. They'll blame the Yom Kippur War for the '73 oil crisis, and they'll blame Russia's invasion of Ukraine for the uranium squeeze today. But here's the thing, those events weren't the fire, they were just the spark. The room was already soaked in gasoline. The real cause was the decades of dependency, underinvestment, and supply concentration. The geopolitical stuff? That just provided the perfect timing in the political cover.
Pillar number 4 is all in our heads. It's the complacency trap. See, there was an earlier Arab oil embargo in 1967 that totally fizzled out. That led the West to believe the threat wasn't real. In fact, leaders like Nixon actually made things worse by putting price caps on domestic oil, which just encouraged even more imports. For uranium, it was the post-Fukushima retreat from nuclear power. That became an easy political move because of all the cheap Russian natural gas, and it created this perfect illusion that nuclear was both dangerous and just unnecessary. In both eras, policymakers made choices that actively deepened the trap.
So, the dependency is set. They've got the world hooked. But to really execute the crime, to truly spring the trap, you need a choke point, a critical bottleneck in the supply chain that gives you absolute control.
Okay, let's just quickly walk through the nuclear fuel cycle. You mine the uranium, you convert it into a gas, you enrich it, and then you fabricate the fuel rods. But look right there at step 3, enrichment. This is the critical bottleneck. And one country, Russia, controls something like 40% of the entire world's enrichment capacity. This is the exact point where a vulnerability turns into a weapon.
And this brings us right to pillar number 5. Back in 1973, the U.S. just didn't have enough refinery capacity. So even if they could get crude oil from countries that weren't part of the embargo, they had a really hard time turning it into gasoline. Today, the West is facing the exact same problem with uranium. You can buy all the raw uranium you want from allies like Canada or Australia, but it's pretty much useless if you have to send it to Russia for conversion and enrichment. Owning the choke point, it's everything.
Okay, so that brings us to the final piece of the trap being set. This is the point of no return, the vanishing buffer. It's the safety cushion that was hiding the growing deficit for years.
Think of it like this. In the years before '73, the U.S. was a huge oil producer itself. But then, domestic production peaked in 1970. That safety net, that ability to absorb supply shocks, was suddenly gone. For uranium, the buffer was a program called megatons to megawatts, where old Soviet nuclear warheads were literally converted into reactor fuel. It dumped a mind-boggling 500 million pounds of uranium onto the market, keeping prices artificially low for decades. Well, that program is over. The buffer is gone, and the market is now completely exposed.
The trap is set. The crisis is triggered. Now for the final act of the crime, the heist. So, who gets rich? All we have to do is follow the money.
So the first group of winners is the most obvious one, the sovereign giants. We're talking about the nations that control the strategic resource and can now turn that control into incredible wealth and geopolitical power.
In 1973, that was Saudi Arabia. Today, as you can see from this chart, it's Kazakhstan. They control a staggering 40% of global uranium production, and their state-owned company, Kazatomprom, is running the OPEC playbook to perfection, focusing on a value-over-volume strategy to manage supply and keep prices high. Make no mistake, they are the new Saudi Aramco of the nuclear world.
Next up, you've got the industrial titans. These are the private companies that own the irreplaceable mines and the processing facilities, which allows them to rake in massive profits from the shortage.
Back in 1974, Exxon became the world's biggest corporation. Today's equivalent? It's Cameco, the Canadian uranium giant. I mean, just look at these numbers. Their revenue growth is just exploding, and their earnings per share, which is a key measure of profitability, is up over 200%. And here's the kicker. They also own a huge stake in Westinghouse, the company that builds the actual reactors. That's like owning the oil well, the refinery, and the gas station.
But there's a new category of winner this time around. One that just didn't exist back in 1973. This is where Act 2 of our crime gets a modern twist. Financial engineering has opened the door for investors to get in on the action and get direct exposure to the commodity itself.
See, financial vehicles like the Sprott Physical Uranium Trust have totally changed the game. They literally buy and hold physical uranium, allowing investors to bet directly on the price without having to deal with all the risks of, actually running a mine. It creates a pure play on the commodity shortage itself, an opportunity that the average person just couldn't get their hands on during the oil crisis.
So, the blueprint is clear. The winners are in position. The final question is, where are we in this story? How far along is this second crime?
And this is just so important to remember. These crises, they don't just happen. They're not black swan events. They are built slowly, deliberately, over years, through a series of decisions that all seem rational at the time, but when you put them all together, they create this huge systemic vulnerability. They only look inevitable after the trap has already been sprung.
Now let's look at the timeline. The 1973 oil crisis didn't actually hit its peak price for 7 years. So if that's our map, then the current uranium cycle, we're somewhere around 1974 or 75. We're past the initial shock for sure, but we're only in the early stages of the price really catching up to the new reality. The full adjustment? It could still have years left to run.
And here is the final twist, the thing that makes this second act potentially even more dramatic. In the 70s, high oil prices eventually led to conservation and more efficiency, and that crushed demand. But today's demand for nuclear power, it's a whole different animal. It's being driven by climate change policy. We've got 28 nations that have formally pledged to triple their nuclear capacity. This demand is government-mandated, which makes it far stickier and a lot less sensitive to price than oil demand ever was.
So there you have it. The criminal's blueprint is now public record, a 6-step process to manufacture a crisis. It worked for oil, it's working for uranium, and that leaves us with one final, pretty unsettling question. Now that we know exactly how the trap is built, the real question isn't if it will be set again, but when and for what commodity.